Welcome everybody to our special event tonight. We're very honored to be meeting today with Sari Bashi. My name is Alex Jones. I'm going to be just introducing our event today very, very briefly. I'm working with the Green Olive Collective. We're the organization who put this event together. So I'll just say a very short couple of words about us before I pass you over to our main host for the night. Green Olive is an Israeli-Palestinian social cooperative. We've been around for 13 years now, and our bread and butter, the thing we do predominantly, is giving educative and political tours on the ground in Israel, Palestine, hoping to educate people about the political realities on the ground here. We try to see everything through the frame of trying to promote democratic values and human rights. And in the days of the pandemic, we started to branch out and put together many virtual tours and different online events and webinars. If you haven't seen them all, I encourage you to go to our website and have a look. There's some really, really cool events on there. And we saw no reason to stop just because the pandemic seems to be receding. So you're all welcome to come and visit us physically. But we also are very happy to be still hosting an event every month or so online. Our event today is going to be with the wonderful Sari Bashi. She's going to be speaking to us in just a moment about her experiences and the writing and activism work that she does. All of the work which we're doing online, all of our online events and tours, there's no registration fee or cost to join today's event. But just like all of our other events, if you do enjoy yourselves today and you feel like it was worth contributing something, we encourage everybody to pay whatever they felt the webinars and the tours were worth at the end. I'll be pasting a link in the chat feature so you can contribute whatever you want to, big or small, it's completely up to you. But this is very much appreciated by everyone in our collective, of course. And I should say that Sari has very generously decided to donate her speaker's fee today to a really cool sounding charity, which I'll allow her to speak a bit more about when she talks to you all. And of course, we are still donating 10% of our proceeds to the PCRF, the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, who provide amazing medical care to kids, especially in places like Gaza, where they just wouldn't be getting the care if not for PCRF. So you'll be supporting 3 very good causes if you want to contribute something at the end of today's event. So I think that's about all I'm going to say as by way of an introduction. You didn't come here to listen to me, you came here to listen to Sari. So I'm going to turn my microphone off. I'm going to introduce you now to Sari, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much to Green Olive Collective and to Alex for hosting me, and thank you to all of you for giving us your time today. What I'd like to do is speak for maybe about 20 minutes and then have some back and forth conversation discussion. And I want to just maybe give a plug for the Haifa Association, which is the organization that Alex mentioned. So half of your donations today will go to the Haifa Association. It's a grassroots organization founded by a father in Gaza whose son was diagnosed with diabetes at the age of 4, and they do education work. They collect money to buy supplies for children with diabetes. They have events to try to kind of help parents learn how to manage diabetes, which can be really important. So if I'm going to talk a lot about Gaza today, and if you're persuaded, consider giving to the Haifa Association. Okay, so let me start with a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking to you today from Raleigh, North Carolina, in the United States. Before European settlers took over the land on which Raleigh sits, it sat between the territories of the Tuscarora, the Catawba, and the Sioux-In, native peoples who apparently used it as hunting grounds. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, my background, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the book that I published so far in Hebrew called Maklooba, Upside Down Love. I'm going to move to talk a bit about the blog that I write about raising my children in the West Bank, in the Ramallah area. And I'm going to connect that all to some political context that I think has been in the media and on people's minds lately. So let me see if I can do those 3 things. So first of all, just a little bit about myself. So I'm a human rights lawyer. I'm currently working as a special advisor for Human Rights Watch. In the past, I co-founded and then directed an Israeli human rights group called Gisha, which provides legal assistance to Palestinians in Gaza who need permits from the Israeli military in order to travel. But I didn't start out like that. I actually grew up in the United States, not in Israel, Palestine. My parents were mixed. My father is an Iraqi-born Jewish person who grew up in Israel and then came to the United States as an adult, where he met my mother, who is from the United States, and she's also Jewish. As a child, I grew up around Jewish communities, and they were primarily European Jewish communities or Ashkenazi Jewish communities. So I didn't have a way of connecting my father's Iraqi identity to something larger because I didn't see other Jews who were not Ashkenazi. So as a kid, for example, when we were small, my father used to make this like really yummy breakfast for us on Saturday mornings. And it was fried eggplant and hard-boiled egg and sesame paste and salad and pita. And we called it the daddy breakfast because it was a breakfast that only my father made, and we understood that other people's fathers didn't make it. So I thought it was just something special to my father. And then when I got older and I started traveling to Israel to see my family there, my father's family is still living in and around the Tel Aviv area. And I saw that at my uncle's and my grandmother's house, they were also eating that breakfast. I thought it was some kind of family recipe. And it was only much later when sabich, which is a traditional Iraqi breakfast food, became popular and they started selling it at falafel stands in Israel, that I realized that actually the food and also my father's background was part of a larger culture, a very rich culture of Iraqi Jews who had then moved to Israel in the 50s. And there was a lot more to discover. And I wanted to discover it. And the other thing I'll say about my background is that as a child, I went to a religious Jewish school. And I didn't come from a particularly political home. We didn't talk about politics. And we didn't talk about politics that much in the school. But I was a child in 1987 when the first Palestinian intifada or uprising broke out. And I remember in my school, they taught about the Intifada as part of an unbroken line of a history of persecution of the Jewish people. So we learned that the inquisitors in Europe persecuted Jews and the Nazis persecuted Jews, and now the Arabs were persecuting Jews. And I didn't question that. It also was something taking place very far away, so it didn't have much meaning to me. Until as a young adult, I traveled to Israel to explore a bit my father's background and what it might mean for me. I started working as a journalist for the Associated Press in Jerusalem, and I got a chance to see things for myself, to see what was going on in Israel, Palestine. And this might be an obvious point, but it wasn't obvious to me. And what I saw is that actually in Israel, the people in authority happen to be Jewish, but they're wielding authority. They're wielding state authority. And Palestinians resisting that, what they consider to be an abuse of authority, were not attacking Jews. They were resisting authority. And I saw that there were human rights abuses going on. And I agreed with the Palestinians who were resisting occupation that the Israeli authorities were misusing their power. And that's a very different issue from anti-Semitism. And I saw that, and I wanted to be able not just to write about what I saw as human rights abuses, but also to take a stand against them, to take a side. And from my point of view, it was the side against authorities that were behaving in an abusive way. So I went to law school. I did my clerkship, my articling period at the Israeli Supreme Court, which was a good way to see how the Israeli legal system dealt with claims of human rights abuses. And it wasn't very encouraging. It was hard to see what many judges there signed off on in ways that I would say were against international law. And so I decided that I didn't want to continue at the court, but I co-founded a human rights group together with a more senior colleague, and that's Gisha, which I mentioned at the beginning. And this might be a good time actually to put up the map that I mentioned, because just to give us a little bit of orientation. So basically, Gisha is trying to address a concern about a lack of freedom of movement for folks in Gaza. So if you look at the map, you can see that whole area is historic Palestine or mandatory Palestine or the biblical land of Israel, the territory between the Mediterranean River, the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, that includes the state of Israel within its internationally recognized borders, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And for much of history, that whole area was a single political, economic, social, cultural unit with freedom of movement between the different areas. So people had ties everywhere. And in 1948, with the outbreak of the 1948 war and the eventual creation of the State of Israel, those areas were temporarily separated without freedom of movement. And Gaza became mostly populated by Palestinian refugees, people who fled or were forced out of their homes in Israel, in what became Israel, and were living in the Gaza Strip in refugee camps. And today, Gaza is about 70% refugees in terms of the population. So the concern that I was trying to address in founding Gisha was an increasing closure of the Gaza Strip after a few decades in the beginning of the 1967 occupation, in which Gaza was open and there was freedom of movement between Israel and Gaza and the West Bank. Beginning in the 1990s, that was starting to be squeezed shut, to the point where by 2005, there was almost no ability to travel between Gaza, the West Bank, and Israel. And this was very damaging for people who needed to leave Gaza for educational opportunities, to go to Palestinian universities in the West Bank, to reunite with family, to get medical care. And so I began to work on those issues, first as just a lawyer providing legal assistance, and later as somebody who had a staff and found an organization that also engaged in public advocacy and advocacy before decision makers. And one of my first clients was a man who was originally from Gaza. He was born in a refugee camp in Gaza, but he was living in the West Bank. And part of the policy of the Israeli government in terms of movement is not to allow people from Gaza to be present in the West Bank, because the Israeli government has relinquished its territorial claims in the Gaza Strip, but it does continue to pursue territorial claims in the West Bank. And so it wants to minimize the number of Palestinians there. So he was actually trapped in the West Bank city of Ramallah for 6 years, because he was afraid that if he were to leave the city and cross a checkpoint, a soldier would see that his address was listed as Gaza in the Israeli-controlled population registry and basically remove him to Gaza, away from his home. He was married at the time, he had a son, away from his family, away from his work. So I represented him for 4 years. And through a court petition that I submitted on his behalf, he was able to leave Ramallah and even make it to London for a PhD program that he did. And when he came back, about 4 years after I first met him, I fell in love with him. And then the lawyer-client relationship ended and a different kind of relationship began. And that's really what the book that I wrote is about. I wrote a book called Maklooba, Upside Down Love. And it's about how my partner and I met, fell in love, and stayed together. So far, so good. So I started writing it as journal entries. Although I had known the West Bank and knew Palestine as a human rights lawyer, as a human rights activist, as a journalist, loving somebody who was Palestinian helped me see Palestine through fresh eyes. I was like a tourist, and I discovered new things about it, things that might have been obvious, but I didn't think about them. So obvious things like people in Palestine have sex and they tell raunchy jokes. And it's also a very conservative society. And Ramallah, where my partner was living, is very much of a bubble. In the sense that it's the most liberal, the most anonymous, probably the richest area of Palestine. And so it's a bit like Tel Aviv in that sense. It has its own characteristics. And living in the Ramallah area and loving my partner also gave me a new perspective on the geography of the travel restrictions in the West Bank. So although I knew them well as a human rights lawyer, as a journalist, all of a sudden I saw them from a different point of view. I'm a long distance runner. And so I would do my long distance runs in villages around Ramallah, because you reach the end of Ramallah pretty quickly when you're doing 50-kilometer practice runs for ultra marathons, which is what I was doing. And I would see how scarred the landscape was, with various checkpoints and roads that were forbidden. The West Bank is divided into areas that are permitted for Palestinians and areas that are off limits for Palestinians and permitted for Israeli Jews only. Actually, Israeli citizens only, but the settlers are primarily Jewish. And so because I was a runner and I was on foot, I could trespass boundaries. I could cross physical obstacles that prevented cars. And I could use my identity to be whoever I needed to be in that moment to be safe, and see a lot of different aspects of the travel restrictions. And I also saw the travel restrictions through the eyes of my partner, whom I'll call Osama, as a pen name, or as a name that protects his privacy. And I saw that he didn't know where a village that was just a few kilometers away was, because of the checkpoints and the forbidden roads. It messed with his sense of geography. So if you want to go from here to here, but you have to do this to get there, you don't really have a good spatial orientation. And that was new to me. And I saw the layers of restrictions in working with him to get the permits he needed to do relatively ordinary things. Loving him also gave me a new perspective on Gaza. I saw Gaza through his eyes. Life in refugee camps, the fact that people were living in such density with such thin walls that his family could hear their neighbors' farts while they were sitting in their own living room, because it was so condensed. And also I learned about his mother's economic independence. She was a single mother, and in Gaza, there are not a lot of economic opportunities for women. And so I learned what it was like for her to have to be reliant on her brothers economically, because of the structure there. I wrote the book in two voices. So it's alternating chapters, one chapter from my perspective, and then the next from my partner's perspective, in dialogue with each other, sometimes direct and sometimes less direct. And Maklooba in Arabic means upside down. It's actually a very traditional Palestinian chicken and rice dish that you cook in a pot. And when you're finished cooking, you turn it upside down on a serving platter in order to serve it. And I called it Maklooba because pretty quickly, Osama and I realized that very important things in Israel-Palestine were upside down, were not as they should be. And for us, we were trying to find a space for our love to exist. And it was difficult. Because of the travel restrictions, Palestinians are not allowed to enter Israel. So he couldn't come to see me in Tel Aviv. And it was illegal for me as an Israeli citizen to come see him in Ramallah, because for the last 22 years, the Israeli authorities have outlawed Palestinian cities for all but Palestinian ID card holders. So we had to create our own space, a non-space space where we could be together. So writing the book was one thing, publishing it was another. There are a lot of privacy issues that came up, not just for myself. It's my own story. It's a very personal story, but also for the people I was writing about. So I might have agreed to publish, but the people, my friends, my neighbors, and my family didn't agree. And particularly when you're talking about children, which came up later with the blog, it's a hard decision to expose them in that way. There were also security issues for both of us with my publishing it. So what I ended up doing was writing a blog in Haaretz, which is an Israeli newspaper that appears in both Hebrew and English, in the family section of Haaretz. The blog sits in the Hebrew version. And I wrote it under a pen name, Forat, which means mother of Forat, mother of my daughter. And I did that for a while until I decided that that I was ready to publish. And I did that after we had moved to the United States for a sabbatical year. So I published the book last year, and we've been here ever since, and it was easier to do it from far away. The book, I think, is just a story about two people who come together and bring the baggage from past relationships and their own fears and insecurities like any two people, but in a context that is not ordinary, because our relationship was transgressive and in some ways actually unlawful. And so the book weaves in narratives of language, belonging, and also occupation, and what it's like to live in Israel-Palestine for Israelis and Palestinians. Writing it gave me a fresh perspective, not just on Palestine, but also on Israeli society. Because although I knew Israel, seeing it from Osama's point of view made me see different things. I became more sensitive, for example, to how militarized the society is. And all of a sudden I was running from Palestinian areas, and I had to wonder, well, my running partner, who was doing reserve duty near an Israeli settlement, is he going to be driving the Jeep that's patrolling the road that I'm running on? What'll I do if I meet him? My cousin's son, is he going to be the one to check me when I'm crossing through Qalandia crossing? It changed the way I saw the Israeli participation in the occupation. What I'd like to do is read a really short excerpt from the book, which the book has been published in Hebrew, not yet in English, but I've translated this excerpt just to give you a sense of what I'm trying to do in the book. And the excerpt that I would like to read is in Osama's voice. And it tells a story of him having a rare opportunity to visit Gaza after not being allowed to go back for 17 years. So the context is that the Israeli government doesn't allow travel between Gaza and the West Bank for Palestinians. So even though he was from Gaza and his mother and brothers and family and friends were all in Gaza, he wasn't allowed to visit. He couldn't get a permit to visit until there came a point when the Israeli authorities made exceptions in the rules against travel, and they allowed travel for exceptional humanitarian circumstances that, as of 2011, included the ability to travel if a first-degree relative died. And his older sister died, and he was able to get a permit to visit Gaza for the first time in 17 years. So the excerpt that I'm going to read from the book, and this might be a good time also to put up the photo of the book, is it's called 17 Years, and it's about his visit to the Jabalia refugee camp after 17 years. 17 years. Usually people measure distance in kilometers or miles. I measure it in years. When I got out of the taxi, a pack of teenagers and children welcomed me, apparently my nieces and nephews. I recognized only Edin and Arish. I asked the others to speak so that I could recognize them by their voices, familiar to me from telephone conversations. I guessed right for 3 of them. Do you want to come to the morning tent first? My brother Muhammad asked me. I want to see Mama. I held back my emotions as best I could when my mother started to cry. Many of my female relatives avoided shaking my hand. I wasn't offended. I noticed my sister-in-law, Renad, and offered her my hand. Instead of shaking it, she put her hand on her heart and smiled. I said to her, "You don't want to shake my hand? Then take this." I touched her lightly on her cheek and immediately left the room. I heard her laughing behind me. I met Salam, Muhammad's wife, for the first time. Omar cried bitterly. We kept our arms tightly wrapped around each other for about 5 minutes. It sparked a protest from Renad, who later said to him, laughing, "It's been years since you hugged me the way you hugged Osama." I couldn't hold back my tears. Hayat had become very weak in the last 3 days of her life. Muhammad had tried to tempt her with her favorite foods so that she would get stronger. On her last day, she didn't eat anything. A week after her death, Muhammad forgot and went to her bed to offer her a piece of chocolate. I remember the basbousa she used to make for us when we were little. Goodbye, my precious Hayat. So that story is an example of something that I learned anew, loving Osama. As a lawyer, I represented people who were trying to visit family members, but it wasn't until I saw from his point of view what it was like to experience that kind of family separation that I think I understood it in a different way. I want to briefly talk about my blog and then open it up to questions and discussion. And maybe a good way to segue into the blog is to address the question of why I'm writing about my personal life, the book and the blog. And I think for me, a lot of it is trying to reach an audience of Israeli readers who might not choose to read about the occupation, but are interested in a story. And the book gave me access to a different kind of audience. Last month, it won a literary prize from the Israeli Ministry of Culture, a prize for first-time authors. So it got in the hands of a group of judges appointed by the Ministry of Culture, which is an audience I certainly would not have gotten into. And the blog is serving a similar goal, to try to just get people to see what's going on. I also think there's something disruptive in a good way about the book and the blog, in that they challenge people's assumptions. They challenge the stereotypes about Palestinian society, stereotypes about Israeli society, and also this very dichotomous opposition between the two. I also, in my writing, certainly in the blog, I talk about what it's like to be an Arab Jew. A Jew of Arab descent or an Arab of Jewish descent, which is not necessarily the way most Israelis see it. And there's something disruptive, hopefully disruptive of categories that the Israeli authorities have created that set people in opposition to each other, Arabs and Jews, even though nearly half of the Jews in Israel are actually also Arab. And the writing is a way to try to talk about things that can be hard to see or that people don't want to see. And that's maybe the function of Osama's voice. So I want to give you a short excerpt from my blog, but I want to frame it in the context of something that people have been talking a lot about lately. And it's a topic that can be difficult for some people. And the topic is apartheid. And the increasing use of an apartheid framework to describe what's happening in Israel-Palestine. And maybe what I will, let me give a quick introduction to the excerpt that I want to read from the Forat blog. And then I'll try to explain why that's related to apartheid in my view. So I mentioned that in the West Bank, there are separate areas for Palestinians and for Jews, and there are fixed checkpoints and then flying or surprise checkpoints that police access to those areas. And in general, Palestinians are not allowed to enter Israel. And so when Osama and I had children, I needed to find a way to explain that to my daughter, Forat. And in the excerpt that I'm going to read to you, she was 5 years old, and we had recently returned from another trip to the United States, an extended stay, and we'd come back to Israel-Palestine, to the Ramallah area. And she knew, I had told her that there are people who stand at checkpoints and they have trouble sharing. And because they have trouble sharing, they don't want to let her father pass. And that's why Baba can't come with us to the sea or to a family dinner in Tel Aviv or to the clinic. And that Ima and Baba don't agree. And we think the soldiers should do a better job sharing. So that's what she knew about checkpoints. And she knew that Baba couldn't come with us to a lot of things. And I don't think she knew this, but this status of who can pass and not pass is highly constructed. So for example, my father was born in Iraq. But I have Israeli citizenship from him because when he arrived in Israel, he was classified as Jewish and given privileges and rights that Israeli Jews get. Osama's mother, my mother-in-law, was born in Majdal, in what is now the Israeli coastal city of Ashkelon. But she's lived her entire life in a refugee camp in Gaza because she fled during the fighting and was not allowed to come back. And her son, even though he's married to me, can't enter Israel. Or even the parts of the West Bank that are reserved for Israeli Jews. So that's the broader context. My daughter didn't know any of that. She only knew that we were traveling to Tel Aviv, and it was for a memorial service for my uncle. And it was just going to be me and her little brother because her father couldn't come. He didn't have a permit. And surprisingly, we were actually turned back. There was a surprise checkpoint or a flying checkpoint. And I'm going to read to you about the conversation that she and I had when we were turned around at the checkpoint. So we're driving from the Ramallah area. We turned down the steep winding street that leads from Deir Ebziyeh to the main road. It was a stunning view of sky, clouds, and green plants scattered on agricultural terraces among brown soil and white rocks. We approached the T-junction at the bottom, where Palestinian drivers reached the main road, used by both settlers and Palestinians, stretching west toward the checkpoint between the Palestinian village of Na'alim and the Israeli settlement of Modi'in Elit. The yellow iron gate was closed. 2 soldiers stood before us in front of a parked army jeep. I remembered the attack that had taken place the week before at the spring near Deir Ebziet and the Israeli settlement of Dolev. 17-year-old Rina Shenrav was killed and her father and brother injured. In the aftermath, settlement leaders called on the Israeli government to close the superfluous entrances to Palestinian towns. I stopped the car. "Good morning," I said. The older soldier, wearing glasses, answered me. "It's closed here. You can't pass." "How do I reach the main road?" I asked. "Through a different entrance." "Where?" "I don't know." I carefully made a U-turn on the narrow road. "Ima, why are we turning around?" Forat asked. "You remember those people who stand at checkpoints?" I asked Forat. "The ones who have trouble sharing?" She said. "Yes. Well, they put up a checkpoint and they are not letting us cross." "But Ima," Forat said, "we're Jews." So that was actually the first time that I heard my daughter refer to herself as Jewish. And what's interesting to me about that conversation, actually my heart stopped during that conversation, is that nobody had ever told Forat that Jews can pass and Palestinians can't. But she did what all 5-year-olds do. She looked around and observed things about the world, and then put together a puzzle of reality based on those observations. And I want to suggest that the puzzle that she put together looks a lot like apartheid. So Jews can and Palestinians can't. Jews can enter Israel. Jews can access healthcare. Jews can have a set of privileges that Palestinians can't. So apartheid has a legal definition. It's a crime against humanity that has 3 elements. And those elements are an intent by authorities to maintain the domination of one ethnic group over another, a context of systematic oppression, and the commission of inhuman or inhumane acts. My daughter's not a lawyer. She didn't know any of that, but she lived that experience. And she quickly realized that there are 2 sets of people. And that's why it was confusing to her when we, who were supposed to be part of the privileged group, were turned back. We were turned back because the soldiers thought we were Palestinian. We were coming from a Palestinian area. And when later on, when a number of international organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Israeli organizations like B'Tselem, also said that apartheid is being practiced in Israel-Palestine, in doing that, they joined Palestinian organizations and activists who'd been saying it for years or even decades. And I realized that it's not surprising that Palestinians said it first, because like my daughter, they live it. And when you live it, it becomes more obvious. The book and the blog that I wrote are my attempt to show that story. So not necessarily to tell it, but to show it. And I know that it can be a hard story to hear, but I welcome a chance to talk about it. Questions, comments, discussion, whatever you'd like.
Thank you very, very much, Sari. We really, I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say we really appreciate hearing from you, and you do have an amazing way of retelling the kind of stories that you mentioned today. So thank you very much. One thing I forgot to say at the beginning of the session is that we are going to have time for questions. So I'm sure that many of you in the audience have got questions. But I'm going to start by asking a question myself, if that's okay. I know that right now you're in the States, and there was a post on the blog a few weeks ago about how your children are kind of bringing their identities from Israel-Palestine to the States, and how that kind of fits in with other children there and other kind of social and political issues there. And I wonder if you see any kind of advantages maybe to the experiences that they've had. Are they more prepared to deal with some of these issues, or is it kind of difficult for them to fit into this new reality?
No, absolutely. And thank you for the question. You know, it's funny because when I started having kids, it was around the time that my other friends in Israel were also having kids. And parents worry, and I looked at their worries and I looked at my worries, and I realized that to some extent, I actually am. I actually managed to protect my children. So it might not surprise you that most of my friends are liberal. Most of my friends don't agree with a lot of what's going on in Israel. Many of my friends don't want their children to be indoctrinated with racist material in the Israeli educational system. And they also are concerned about their children serving in the army and being implicated in human rights abuses. And I even have many friends who leave, have left. And they leave when their kids are young. They leave when the boy becomes 5 years old, because they don't want to take the chance that if they wait until he's 12, when he's 17, he'll come back and join the army, because they want to protect him from that. And there's actually a blog post that I wrote about an experience that I had with my son. My son was 2 years old at the time, and I took him out for an early morning run in a residential area in the Ramallah area. And I'm running, and unexpectedly, I encounter soldiers who are throwing tear gas at a residential area. And so I'm obviously trying to get my son away from the tear gas, running away. It was fine. He was fine. I was fine. We got back home. And later I spoke to a friend of mine in Tel Aviv who has a son my son's age as well. And he listened to me, laughed, and he said, "Are you sure you want to raise your kids there? Are you sure you want to live there?" And of course, I didn't say this to him, but what I thought was, I have a challenge that I need to protect my son from soldiers throwing tear gas in a residential area. But you have a challenge of how do you prevent your son in 16 years from being the soldier who throws the tear gas in a residential area? And the answer is he can't. So in that sense, I think I've actually managed to protect my children. My children will never be racist against Arabs or Jews or Palestinians. It'll be really hard for them to hate either Israeli Jews or Palestinians. And I hope it'll be hard for them to hate anyone, because they live on the edge in the middle of two worlds, at least two worlds.
Yeah, great. If I can have another question, I know there's plenty of people who would like to ask questions, but I'm going to steal one more of my own. I tend to try and avoid this dichotomy of Israelis and Palestinians, but I'm going to fall into the trap. Do you feel like among your friends and family on both sides of the Israel-Palestine divide, are they kind of equally surprised that you're living together in Ramallah, or does it sort of harder for one side or the other to kind of reckon with this dual nature that you and your family have?
I think everybody responds differently, and I think the biggest difference in responses is individual. Just people have their own individual responses. So I would say for our families, Osama's family has been quite supportive, but on the other hand, it's easy for them to be supportive because they don't see us and we don't see them. So my kids have never met their grandmother. We can't visit. They can't come to the West Bank. We can't go to Gaza. So over the phone, they're welcoming, but they also don't have to deal with us in any real way, unfortunately. Which is very painful. And if anything, I think probably Osama's mother struggles more with Osama's lack of religious fervor. Osama is an atheist who's secular, and that's harder for her than me being Jewish. And most interpretations of Islam say that it's okay for a Muslim man to marry a monotheistic woman, either Jewish or Christian. And because of patriarchy, it's assumed that her religion doesn't matter. She's sort of subsumed by his identity. So from, it's all good from their point of view, mostly, as far as I can tell over the phone. My family is more mixed. There are some people in my family who've been amazingly supportive. My mother, when I like gathered up my courage and I called her to tell her I'd moved in with my partner in the Ramallah area, and I didn't know what to expect. And she asked me, this was her first question. She said, "Well, does he treat you well?" And I wasn't prepared for that question. That's a great question. She's been amazingly supportive. And for other people in my family, it's been harder. either because of racism or because of religious beliefs that see a Jewish person marrying a non-Jewish person as a national tragedy. And that's been hard. In terms of friends and family, you know, it's not the first thing I mention when I meet people. It's also actually something that I'll do lots of things to avoid the question, where do you live? Just because it's very interesting and people don't always want to be interesting. But it's a process, especially in Ramallah, navigating it. Speaking Hebrew with my kids in the street, it's a process.
Cool. Thank you for sharing. So my friends, if anybody has questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. It's probably the most organized way we can do this, and we'll try our best to get to all of the questions. There's a great question coming from Daniel Easterman. Daniel, if you'd like to unmute yourself, you can ask Sari directly. If you prefer, I can read the question for you, but if you're there, Daniel, you can ask your question.
Yep, sure. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Yeah. So yeah, just first of all, I'd like to say thanks very much for this really valuable perspective. It's definitely very interesting because and I'll just go straight to it. So what made you decide to not be anonymous anymore?
I wanted to publish the book. I wanted to get the story out. And what I understood from the publisher was that if it were published anonymously, it would be much more difficult because there needed to be somebody behind it to promote it. We had really good media coverage, but there needed to be somebody to give interviews for the media. And when I go back to Israel, I do want to have events and try to promote the book as well. And so that's what made me overcome my reluctance. And I hope it's okay. I haven't been back since I published it, so.
Okay, thanks. And just to follow up on that, why did you decide to be anonymous in the first place, and what do you think would be the potential repercussions of this quite brave decision?
So, I mean, look, there are security risks associated with our lives, and that was primary. There are also privacy issues. You know, I think for anybody, even if you're publishing a book about ordinary family life, it's deeply private, and it may sound strange, but I'm actually a very private person, and maybe that's why I wrote a book, because it's easier for me to share when there's two steps to it, and the first step is just me in front of the computer, and the next step is sharing. And so maybe it was a way for me as an introvert to communicate, and also I think I've struggled with being interesting. I've struggled with having to account for myself a lot in Ramallah. And it's easier for me to have a professional identity as a human rights lawyer, as a human rights activist. Talking about one's personal life is harder, but I wanted to do it because I'm trying to tell a story that I hope will also have a tiny effect on the way people view Israel-Palestine.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks for the question, Daniel. And a few people have asked, sorry, is there any chance of an English translation of the book coming soon? Is this something we can expect? Or?
Absolutely, I hope so. I'm working on it. I'm actually trying to find a book agent. So I have a draft translation. I think there's some adaptations I need to make it more accessible to a foreign audience. Mm-hmm. So I think one of the ways that the book works for Israeli readers is that it tells a very familiar story, but from a different perspective. But when it's for a foreign audience, I think there's additional work that needs to be done to make the content more accessible.
Great. So I'd love to call next on Ulrich Sam. If you'd like to ask your question, Ulrich, we'd love to hear from you.
Well, the question is very simple. Does she know of any Jewish Israeli man being married to a Palestinian woman?
Yes.
Same thing, other way around.
Yes, I think it's less common, and part of it might be the religious beliefs on either side. So I mentioned that for Muslims, for example, our kids are Muslim because religion for Islam goes according to the father. Well, for Jews, religion goes according to the mother. So my mother-in-law thinks the kids are Muslim. My mother thinks the kids are Jewish. Everybody's happy. It's a little bit easier than the other way around.
Thanks, Ulrich. Thanks, Sari. Sandra Mufti, are you there? Would you like to ask your question, Sandra?
Sure. I just was, I guess, wondering about traveling to Gaza. First of all, it seems like people can't go from one area to another, the West Bank to Gaza, even though they're so close together. My question is, can Sari and her kids go to Gaza if they feel like visiting? And I know the answer is no, but I want to understand why. Do you need to be a humanitarian, have a special pass? As a tourist, do you need a special pass? Why is it it's prohibited for others to go to that area?
Sure, no, it's a good question. So at least for the last decade, the Israeli authorities have instituted a fairly tight closure on the Gaza Strip, and they only allow travel under what they consider to be exceptional humanitarian circumstances. So what constitutes an exceptional humanitarian circumstance changes. Sometimes it's a little more generous, sometimes it's a little bit less generous. Right now, it's limited to people needing to leave for medical care, travel if a first degree relative has passed away or is getting married, and some travel for merchants considered necessary for economic activity. That's true for Palestinians. So that's why my partner can't see his parents, see his mother, and why she can't come to us. In terms of foreigners, it's actually even more restrictive. So journalists, not any humanitarian worker, but humanitarian workers who meet certain criteria have some ability to travel. In general, foreigners can't travel, and Israeli Jews under almost no circumstances are allowed to travel into Gaza. So if anything, I mean, it's hard to say, like I want Osama to be able to go to Gaza, but I know that, let's just say his brothers are already married. So if he were to get a permit to go to Gaza, it wouldn't be for good reasons. And so in that sense, that's what it is. On the other side, people from Gaza are not allowed to leave to go to the West Bank, except under those exceptional circumstances. So I actually was able to meet his brother many years ago when he came to the West Bank for medical treatment for his son who has diabetes. And then I got to meet them, but otherwise I wouldn't have.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. Next, can we hear from Kim? Kim Hakarod, are you there, Kim? Would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Yeah, I had a couple questions. I guess, as it relates to, the future and trying to find resolution. I mean, I guess, I was just curious, what is it going to take? I know the U.S. has had, a lot of involvement in terms of investment to Israel. Is that, a continued barrier? What do you see as, potential resolutions for this conflict?
No, thank you for that question. And I'll say that my perspective on what needs to be done is not oriented toward resolving a conflict, in the sense that I think that there's been a lot of energy put into what people call a peace process, conflict resolution, for the last many decades. And that energy and focus has come at the expense of looking at what's happening on the ground. And what's happening on the ground are pretty severe abuses, and even, I would say, the crime against humanity of apartheid. So from my perspective, where I'm hopeful is that there is starting to be a reorientation toward ending abuses and toward, first of all, naming what's going on as apartheid. And then what flows from that characterization is that it needs to stop. And so, for example, Human Rights Watch and others have made very specific recommendations of what needs to happen to try to end the crime of apartheid. And that would include countries like the United States stopping their support, their complicity in that crime. And that means reviewing bilateral agreements with Israel to avoid contributing to the crime against humanity of apartheid. It means ending military assistance that supports the crime against humanity of apartheid. And it also means naming it for what it is, and eventually accountability for Israeli officials who are complicit in that crime. So that doesn't sound very hopeful, but from my point of view, we've been going down a problematic road for a long time with a focus on the peace process. And what I would like to see us do is focus on ending abuses and focus on what's going on the ground. And I think when we do that, then we can mobilize people toward building something better, building a system that's not based on ethnic superiority or supremacy, Jewish demographic supremacy. in Israel-Palestine, but rather based on values like justice and freedom and equality. And for the first time in a long time, Palestinian young people are starting to organize around those values in a more open way. So less of a national liberation project, which has been stalled, and more demanding basic rights. And I see a lot of promise in that.
Thank you.
Kim, did you have a second question? Feel free to, if you do, that's no problem if not.
Yeah, I mean, it was more of a group of us are going to Jerusalem in a month, and we've done some preparation in terms of some books to read and things to consider and just be prepared. I just wanted to see if you had any recommendations, as we prepare for being in the country and seeing everything firsthand. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I would say that sometimes Palestinian authors don't get as much reading outside of Israel-Palestine as Israeli Jewish authors do. And sometimes people read Israeli liberals like me instead of reading Palestinians. And so I can just suggest some really great sources like Al-Shabaka, which is a Palestinian think tank that does amazing work, really interesting articles. I can recommend PalThink, which is a Gaza-based think tank that has some good materials. Al-Haq, which is a West Bank or Ramallah-based human rights organization that does really good reporting and documentation. And Al-Monitor often has interesting Palestinian voices in English.
And of course, Kim, while you're here on the ground, if you would like to join us for a tour, I can definitely recommend greenoliveTours.com. We'll definitely be able to help you out. Thanks for those questions, Kim. Lillian, you've had your hand up patiently. Would you like to ask Sari a question, Lillian?
Yes, I was wondering, could you speak with your children on the streets of Ramallah in Hebrew? And do your children go to a school in Ramallah, to an Arabic school? And are the curriculum in Ramallah, in the Arabic school, peaceful?
Thank you. Yes, I do speak to my kids in Hebrew, at least I have thus far. We left the West Bank when my daughter, the older one, it was 6 and she's now 8. And I don't know what her experience will be. So the way it works in our house is that I speak to the kids in Hebrew, my partner speaks to them in Arabic, and he and I speak English to each other. So they're trilingual. And I've always been surprised that my daughter answers me in Hebrew. Because many, at least when we're in Palestine, it's funny, in the US, she answers me in English because that's the dominant language. But when we go back and the dominant language is Arabic, which is a language I speak, but not well enough that she'd want to choose it to communicate with me, then she speaks Hebrew pretty well, considering that it's mostly just with me. So when I take her to Israel for dentist appointments or to play with friends, she's pretty good, which is always surprising. I've written a lot about this in my blog, about what it's like to speak Hebrew in Ramallah. I could send you some posts. It's a challenge because the Hebrew language is associated with violence, and it's a beautiful language, but it's a hard language to speak when people hear it and have a negative reaction. And so far, part of my desire to continue speaking Hebrew has been, among other things, an attempt to reclaim it as a beautiful language that should not be associated with violence. But that might be harder as my daughter gets older and I have to take my cues from her. In terms of schools, yeah, I mean, we've sent them so far to private schools and we'll continue to do that for a variety of reasons. And the school that they'll be going to when we go back will be mostly Arabic, but with a strong focus on English. And I think as the kids get older, they have more of a focus on English. So at some point they have like math and science in English as well. Curriculum being peaceful. I mean, my kids have been small, so I don't think that there's anything that's come up in the curriculum that would let me judge that. What I know anyway is that in general, the concerns that I have about the Palestinian curriculum are mostly in the religious textbooks and to a lesser extent in the Arabic textbooks. A lot of them have to do with the way that women are portrayed or girls are portrayed, or in general kind of more conservative values that don't suit my values or my partner's values. I know that there's been a lot of discussion about what people call incitement in Palestinian textbooks. What I can say is that there are materials that are problematic, but there's also a lot of hype about it in ways that I think are not helpful. So if I could rewrite the Palestinian curriculum, I would. And one of the main things I would focus on would be gender roles, because in looking at what my daughter's being exposed to, I think that's actually the most kind of pernicious and problematic.
I just want to say thank you so much for writing and speaking up and not being afraid. I'm Palestinian refugee twice, but now right now I'm in the US too, but I live in Canada. Palestinians now are all over the world. Like I have my children in Switzerland and Denmark, and they meet a lot of Palestinians there. They're all refugees and thinking of one day, maybe our grandchildren can go back to Palestine. Thank you again.
I hope so. Thank you.
Thanks, Lillian. Can I ask next Jeffrey Morrow? Would you like to ask your question, Jeffrey?
Excuse me, Alex, can you please put me on the
yes.
list? I'm sorry, Alex, sorry to interrupt. Can you put me on the list? Thank you, sorry.
Alex, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Jeffrey. Go ahead.
Okay. My question was just, how much of an opportunity is there in Ramallah for is an Israeli Jewish citizen to have a casual or even an extensive relationship with a Palestinian? I just in terms of the nuts and bolts of things on the ground, how many opportunities are there for face-to-face interaction of some sort, hopefully congenial?
Israelis and Palestinians in Palestine being able to interact with each other?
In Ramallah, I'm thinking, in the West Bank.
Well, I mean, there are many Israeli citizens of Israel living in Ramallah, but they're Palestinian citizens of Israel. There are not many Jewish citizens of Israel living in Ramallah. So in Ramallah, very little. In the villages, there is a lot of interaction. Part of it is you have the villages are sort of mixed areas. So they're closer to the settlements. And so you have settlers sometimes coming into villages for grocery shopping. And you have Palestinians who are able to get work permits. There's a few tens of thousands of Palestinians who have permits to work inside Israeli settlements. And you also have a larger number of Palestinians with work permits to work inside Israel. So you have that kind of interaction. It's not a particularly equal interaction. So it's socioeconomically it's employer employee, but it's beyond that because you're not a regular employee. If you're dependent on the Israeli intelligence and military services for your permit, you're very vulnerable in ways that can lead to exploitation. Which is not to say that many Israeli employers are wonderful, but it's a very precarious situation. Some settlers and residents of villages have social ties. You hear about that. There's a very big power dynamic that can be difficult.
Thank you.
Could maybe I'll add a follow-on question there from a few people in the chat, Sari. What about, people such as yourself, Israeli people who want to visit Area A? How common in your experience is that? What are the kind of legal or risks involved? And would settlers be welcome in, Palestinian shop in your experience if it was a smaller village somewhere like that?
So I don't know the dynamics within villages as well. Many people in villages are afraid of settlers. And I know that very well because I'm much more cautious in villages than I am in more urban areas, because in villages, I'm more likely to be mistaken for a settler. And that can be hard, and that can actually be dangerous for me. I have a blog post about running in a village that had been cut off from settlements, and then the settlers kind of made inroads, and like as I'm trying to go home, I realized that if I run back, they're going to think I'm a settler, and like what I had to do to try to mitigate that. I knocked on every door and told them who I was so that they wouldn't think I'm somebody else, right? So that's a hard dynamic. You know, there are financial transactions. There are some villages where it's more established that settlers come in for purchasing, and I guess, you know, I guess they feel okay doing that. I think that for people visiting, if it's specifically Ramallah, which is Area A, there's a blanket prohibition against anybody, including tourists, including Israeli Jews, including Palestinian citizens of Israel, including residents of East Jerusalem, from entering the cities, like the cities themselves, Area A, like Ramallah or Hebron or particular areas. That prohibition is not enforced. So you have a lot of tourists coming into Ramallah. You certainly have a lot of Palestinian citizens of Israel coming to Ramallah. You don't have a lot of Israeli Jews coming to Ramallah. And it's sensitive. You know, I mean, I think you have to be aware of the context. Certainly people in Palestine are surprised by who I am. And I sometimes try to sort of break it to people gently. If they ask me, where are you from? I try to say from among your cousins. And that's like a kind of an oblique reference to the tradition that Ismail or Ishmael and Yitzhak or Isaac were brothers. And so Jews and Muslims are cousins. But it's a hard question to address. When I first moved to the Ramallah area, I tried to keep a very low profile. And then as time went on, I decided to raise the profile. And to some extent, in my immediate surroundings, the grocery store, my kids' schools, neighbors, to actually deliberately let people know who I am. First of all, so they won't think I'm somebody else. So they won't think I'm a settler, and they won't think that I'm there to do harm. And also for my daughter, so that she will learn to be proud of who she is, and that it's not something, she doesn't have to hide who her mother is. It's a calculation that's very fluid. So that's worked so far. We'll see what works when I come back.
Yeah, you're constantly juggling these priorities, right? Jean Kendall, would you like to ask your question? Hello, Jean. Hi, Jean. How are you doing?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. I mean, I think for most of us living in the outside world of Palestine, Israel, it's obviously a massive issue that we all like to sort of think we can try and do something about. Obviously, there's the report from Amnesty International that went out in February, which was obviously had a lot of dynamic stuff in there, accusing Israel of apartheid, and also the issue of BDS, which I know is now a global campaign. I'm just wondering how Suri thinks about the BDS. Does she feel it's having any effect on what's happening in Israel, and does she agree with the whole concept?
Thank you for that. So what I can say is that I'm concerned by the amount of crackdown and censorship on a movement that is a peaceful, legitimate boycott movement. So throughout history, activists have called for boycotts and sanctions. And if we look at what's happening now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we see all of a sudden that it's legitimate to call for sanctions and divestment and boycotts when an authority is engaging in abusive behavior and occupation. So I'm noting the difference between what's considered to be acceptable, for example, for Ukraine, and what's considered to be acceptable for Palestine. And as a human rights activist, I can say that people have a right to engage in peaceful boycott movements. And particularly in the United States, the crackdown, the attempt to silence people from peacefully calling for boycotts or sanctions is very troubling on a lot of levels. And globally, attempts to define anti-Semitism as criticism of the Israeli government or support for the BDS movement are really worrying. And I say this as a Jewish person. I'm concerned about real anti-Semitism. And I'm concerned that when we call BDS anti-Semitism, we're undermining the fight against anti-Semitism. Because calling for a peaceful call to sanction a government that is engaging in human rights abuses, it's many things, but it's not anti-Semitic. I can speak from my organizational hat. So Human Rights Watch doesn't take a position on the BDS movement, and so I won't express a position on the movement itself. What I will say is that people have a right to engage in that kind of activity, and it's for me similar to the kinds of activity that people engaged in during apartheid in South Africa. It was a peaceful way of protesting.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jean. Olivia, would you like to ask your question? How are you doing?
Yes, I would. Well, thank you very much indeed, Sari, for being with us and for your presentation. I came across your blog just by chance a few years ago and thought it was very interesting, thought it was beautifully written. And I thought you grew up in Israel. So in my mind, I was preparing a question about growing up in Israel. And is it okay if I ask you about Israeli youngsters? Is that okay? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
okay.
Of course. Yeah.
Right. We, well, for a start, I live in Europe. I live near Milan in Italy, but I've lived in a few different European countries. My background is rather strange. It's a bit like yours, but perhaps even stranger. And we in Europe, were sometimes superficial. Well, my knowledge about a thing called Israel-Palestine is based on reading, really, and a few visits and lots of friends. And we can be rather superficial and we can be rather ignorant. So bear that in mind and bear with me. This is my question. And also, I must say that we, with the hideous past that we Europeans have, we're not in a position to give lessons to anybody. We can't do that, and that has to be understood. Now, about growing up in Israel, do youngsters, Jewish youngsters, Israeli Jewish youngsters, are they aware of how Palestinians are being treated? You have a country that is subjugating millions and millions of people and depriving them of their human rights. And we won't make the list because everybody listening is well aware of what's going on. It's beyond appalling. It's totally obnoxious. Now, nowadays we live in a global culture, and young Israelis presumably have cousins in the US and cousins in Europe, or travel a lot. And I wonder, because they live in a country that perpetuates Jewish supremacy and legalizes it with all kinds of laws, makes it all sort of normal, do they think, well, we can do this, but they can't. We have the law of return 2,000 years. They don't for 74 years. We can build and expand and, wherever we like, but they can't. It's very difficult because of the land laws. And so on and so forth. I mean, let's not make the list because it's too long. We'd be talking till the cows come home. Now, do they put two and two together and cop on and say, well, I'm excluding the progressive Jewish Israeli people that you frequent and that are, open-minded and have a very broad vision. Thank goodness. And there are lots like you, but not enough. But my question is, these youngsters growing up, when they get to 14, 16, 18, do they feel, are they chauvinist? Are they arrogant? Do they feel, oh, we are the chosen people. This is okay. We can do this. They can't. It doesn't bother us. That's the way things are. How do they grow up? These are not the values that most people, well, when I say most people, it doesn't mean much, usually treat, others like equals and have equal respect for them and feel they should have equal rights. So that's why, I do wonder how these youngsters grow up. Or do they at some stage see the light and feel this is a failure, it's not working. We've had 74 years of conflict after conflict, war after war. It's not getting us anywhere, this system. So I'd like your comments on that, and thank you very much indeed. I won't go on because I don't want to deprive my fellow participants of time.
Sure, thank you, Olivia. One of the things that's worrisome is the extent to which there's been an erosion of universal democratic kind of basic values, especially among young people in Israel over the past few decades. So some of that is a result of interventions and changes to the content of the education ministry, values expressing Jewish supremacy over the land. Even in secular schools in Israel, the idea that this land was given to the Jewish people by God, a lot of fear instilled in people. We've had a populist politician for more than a decade who perpetuated the idea that if we are not in control, we will be in danger. And there's been a lot of young people are afraid of Palestinians, have very negative ideas about Palestinians, and more generally, there's just an erosion of very basic democratic values. So like if you polled young people today and ask them very basic questions, like should Palestinian citizens of Israel be allowed to vote in the Knesset, you'll get a fairly high number, not the majority, who say no. And that's different than years ago. So there's been a lot of very careful planning going into right-wing parties in Israel taking over the education ministry. And there's been a bit of a parallel process within the Israeli military as well. So the military had traditionally been a bit more of a responsible adult within the Israeli political system because it's a longer term actor and they're not elected in the ways that politicians are. But there's been a lot of infiltration of supremacist ideas within the military. I think it was this week, a military commander deliberately chose to do construction renovations in Joseph's tomb, which is a Jewish holy site that's located in the occupied West Bank. And Palestinians had vandalized, had damaged parts of the structure. And he, in having soldiers come in to kind of guard this work, he said very directly, we are doing this because this land belongs to us, because it was promised by God thousands of years ago, and it doesn't belong to anybody else. So that's a kind of education that needs to be undone. And everybody is responsible, but it's not surprising to me that young people hold the values that they do because they've been inculcated in them for a very long time. And that's bad not just for Palestinians, but that kind of supremacist values undermines all kinds of other relationships, social solidarity, relations with women.
Of course. Thank you. You sadly confirmed what I thought. It's a failure. I think the state of Israel is a failure. It fails to provide peace for its citizens, and it's a crackpot. It's a crackpot state with lovely people. Of course, we make a disconnect between the state and people. Obviously.
And a few people in the chat have also commented on the
it's a lunatic system.
In Joseph's tomb. That was
yes, I know. Thank you so much. I enjoyed your blog a lot, and I will look forward to the book, Sari. I will look forward greatly to the book. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Candy, are you available? Would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Welcome to North Carolina. It's where I am too. I realize this is probably overly simplistic, but I was really interested in your turning around our looking at it as apartheid rather than that kind of conflict that we keep talking about. So beyond changing attitudes, are there specific practical things that in your view would be involved in eliminating that apartheid? And for example, if the border restrictions were unilaterally were lifted, where would the refugees go? And what about people on both sides, as you were just talking about, who wanted to reclaim or return to ancient homelands?
Yeah, thank you for that.
I realize this has been the questions for hundreds of years, but how would the getting into the apartheid, getting out of apartheid look in a practical manner?
No, that's a great question. I mean, it would require dismantling the settlements, which are essential colonies that take over Palestinian land and block off access to Palestinians for about 60% of the West Bank in ways that the intent has become clearer, in ways that are deliberately designed to get as much territory as possible, as much land as possible for Jews with a demographic majority. Another thing to do would be to recognize the right of return for Palestinian refugees and their descendants who fled or were expelled from their homes in 1948. And the way that fits into the supremacy, one of the main reasons the Israeli government doesn't want to recognize the right of return and allow people to come back is because it wants a Jewish demographic superiority. And if you recognize the right of return, I don't know how many people would come back, but many might. And then you may not have a Jewish majority, which is one of a primary goal. And just for clarity, right, there are between the river and the sea in that area, whose borders the Israeli government has blurred, there are about 7 million Jews and 7 million Palestinians. So it's about equal, but the travel restrictions serve the purpose of gerrymandering a Jewish majority in the areas that the Israeli government has designated for Jewish settlement. So that's why Gaza looks the way it does. It's a small area about the size of the American city of Philadelphia with 2 million Palestinians in it who are not allowed to travel. And that's a way of taking them off the demographic books while instituting other policies that make it difficult for Palestinians to come to Israel or the West Bank, or in many cases even to remain there. So all of those policies would need to be lifted, including the closure of Gaza. In terms of what people can do, there's a ton people can do. If you live in the United States, you can write to your congressperson, you can write to your senators, and you can ask them to do very specific things. First of all, make sure they are not supporting laws and rules that silence peaceful protest of Israeli policies, whether that's through overly broad and incorrect definitions of anti-Semitism or cracking down on the BDS movement, universities that are silencing Palestinian activists who are criticizing the Israeli government policies. You can encourage those universities to respect the right to academic freedom and freedom of speech. You can ask the American government to stop providing military assistance that is complicit in the crime against humanity of apartheid. The United States supplies nearly $4 billion every year of military assistance to the Israeli government, much of which is used to perpetuate serious international crimes. There's other things you can do in terms of settlement goods. Right now, goods come in from the Israeli settlements labeled as made in Israel. At the very least, they should be appropriately labeled. And there's an argument that says they shouldn't be able to come in at all because they're contributing to serious human rights abuses. The U.S. government in particular is complicit in Israeli perpetuation of these abuses. And one of the most important places to fight apartheid is the United States.
Thank you.
And Candy, if you are interested in the issue of the return of refugees, I can give a quick plug to our next online event, which is coming up to commemorate, what is it now, 74th anniversary of the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe. We're co-hosting an event with Zochot, an Israeli organization we've done an event with in the past. You can see that last year's event on our YouTube channel. This year's event is going to be exploring the issue of the potential return and how the practicalities of that would look and what's going on in certain areas of particularly Israeli parks and how they use parkland to kind of cover up former villages. So that'll be coming up in the middle of May. Nancy Kaplan, would you like to ask your question, Nancy?
Oh, gee, I put so many questions in the chat. I don't know where I could even start, and I don't want to take up a lot of time. So I'll just ask one thing. Where in the United States did Sari grow up? And how long did it take her to become fluent in Hebrew and Arabic when she moved to Israel?
I grew up in New Jersey. I had Hebrew as a child, but it took me a while to be able to do it professionally. So writing legal documents, court papers in Hebrew, but legal writing is weird in any language. So it's always kind of strange and ugly. Arabic, I'm not fluent. I have basic spoken Palestinian Arabic, not as good as I thought or I would hope. So I can get around in the streets and in the schools, but there's a lot of room for improvement.
Just one other quick thing. Do you have a network of friends there? Wait, whoever's not muted, please mute.
No, but well, we sort of did, but they've kind of forgotten.
Okay, thank you. Do you have network, a friendship network of families that are like your family, blended families, blended identities and ethnic backgrounds that are, like a support system of your own with people?
No. There are some families like ours, and I'm in touch with some of them sometimes about like logistical things. But I think for me, support is more just the people that I love, whether or not they're in my position, and my good friends can support me, and I can support them on whatever challenges we're dealing with.
Thanks, Nancy. So just to let everybody know, we won't take too much more of Sari's time. We've got to her until past, so we have another 10 more minutes. So we'll try our best to get through the questions that we have. But I apologize in advance if anyone's question goes unanswered. But next, I'd love to call on Alba. Would you like to ask? Alba had a couple of interesting questions. Are you there, Alba? Hi, Alba. We can't hear you, but you are unmuted.
Hi, can you hear me now?
That's perfect.
Hi?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
perfect.
See,
Yeah.
I would like to ask, like if, like there's been in the last week few terrorist attacks in Israel from Palestinians. And I was just wondering, kind of assuming there's been more control from Israel, more political control in the West Bank, and I was just wondering if how they feel it there, or what's going on there during these last weeks.
So what I would say is that there's a very worrisome escalation going on right now with deadly attacks against Israeli civilians inside Israel, and even more deadly shootings of Palestinian civilians inside the West Bank by Israeli soldiers, and in some cases also shootings of people who've been involved in crimes, but under circumstances in which it seems like the use of lethal force was excessive and unjustified and unlawful. And my concern, and this goes back to the comment earlier about the army, is that in previous times, the army has been a restraining force on the use of force because they understand what it means for there to be an escalation more than politicians sometimes do. And they're longer term actors who are more insulated from political pressure. So they've been holding back politicians in the past. And there have been indications that that's not the case right now. So I'm worried.
Thanks, Sari. Thanks, Alba.
Yeah, and when it's okay, I just let
someone else. Feel free.
Bueno, yeah, I just was wondering, like, because I think I understood, like, her kids are still young, but no sé, maybe there's this worry, like, it's kind of clear their life will be easier if they just go to the other side and move to Israel. When I understand the father, I don't know if there's this worry, like maybe in the future they ask us to move because it's just to have a easier life and get a permit for the father or something like that. And if they thought about this possibility, or they are scared of the kids asking for that in the future. Yeah.
Well, Palestinians in general are not allowed to enter Israel or reunite with Israeli citizen spouses, and that's pursuant to a law that was just recently renewed. So there are humanitarian exceptions. I can put in the chat a link to a blog post about me trying to take advantage of that humanitarian exception. My first request was rejected. My second request has been pending for about 4.5 years. So that's not an option for most people, and right now it's not an option for me. But we'll see. I mean, there's challenges living everywhere. Living in the United States, you see there are challenges in terms of people supporting serious abuses and doing it with their eyes closed. So everywhere parents struggle to raise their kids and do their best. I should also just say, technically, I put into the chat a link to the blog and a link to the book in Hebrew, and also some of the Palestinian writers, the websites where you can find some of the Palestinian writers I mentioned for people who are interested.
Thanks, Sari. Maybe as we're a little short on time, I'll kind of compile a couple of questions into one, if people don't mind. A few people, Sari, are asking more about the controversial word of apartheid. So first of all, do you feel like calling it out as apartheid is helpful? Do you feel like this is productive or sometimes has the opposite effect because it is such a trigger word? Second of all, do you feel like this applies to what's going on in the West Bank, or do you also consider, the 48 borders of Israel kind of a Palestinian state? And the third part of that question is, how appropriate do you think it is to compare to what happened in South Africa? And maybe we need a different word that's more unique to this context.
Sure. No, thank you for those questions. I mean, I can answer in the approach that Human Rights Watch has taken to apartheid. So Human Rights Watch wrote a report last year that concludes that the Israeli authorities are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution. And that's not a comparison with South Africa. Apartheid is an international crime that has a legal definition with those elements that I mentioned. So an official intent to maintain racial domination of one group over another, systematic oppression, and the commission of inhumane acts. So that's a determination that people make based on evidence. I think the evidence for systematic oppression and inhumane acts has been around for a very long time. What changed, at least for Human Rights Watch, was the inability to refute the intent because it's become much more clear. So you've had Israeli officials quite openly saying, we need to have Jewish demographic superiority. We will intend to control Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, forever. These laws that we've in the past justified by reasons of security, we're now admitting that they're demographic. We want Jewish supremacy here. So I think that's what led groups like Human Rights Watch to join Palestinians who've been saying it for years, that it's apartheid. And yes, I think it's helpful. I think it's important to attach a powerful stigma to the actions of the Israeli authorities, and there's a certain clarity to it. So it can get very complicated if you try to look at Oslo peace accords and international law, and there's all these complicating things. But ultimately, the crime of apartheid is based on the very simple principle that my daughter saw: the supremacy of one group over another. And the report that Human Rights Watch wrote concludes that the intent to maintain that supremacy exists throughout the space, Israel, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank, and that all the elements of the crime come together in the occupied Palestinian territory, including Gaza and the West Bank.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a couple more people. We'll try and whiz through the last few just in the last closing minutes. Georgina, would you like to ask a question? Georgina Bednar, are you there?
Yeah, hi, thank you so much for this talk. It's a weird one to ask at the end, but the word Zionism, we've talked a lot about apartheid. Is there any place for this term now? I guess maybe on a personal perspective, but also, maybe it's not a word you connect with, but does it need to go? Is there still a place for the term or the philosophy, or is it kind of dead now?
I mean, I think Zionism is very much alive, and most Jews would define themselves as Zionist. I think many Jews in the diaspora would also define themselves as Zionist, although certainly not all. I think the concern is what acts are being committed in the name of Zionism, and where those acts are abusive and based not on recognizing rights of the Jewish people, but rather on trouncing on the rights of others. That's where we need to be careful. So, I mean, I think many people are Zionist, but I think the question is, are you, in pursuing what you might define as Jewish self-determination or respecting Jewish heritage, are you abusing others? And that's where the line is drawn.
And you think it's possible that there can be Jewish self-determination without that level of oppression? Are the two mutually exclusive?
I mean, look, I think if you look at the Zionist movement, which was Jews coming to Israel from Europe, there were many elements to it. So some of it was fleeing persecution. And these were people who were fleeing horrific genocide. Many of them ended up in Palestine. People who were not able to flee, many of them were murdered as part of the Holocaust. And so should they have been allowed to come? Of course, they should have been allowed to come anywhere, right? That's what refugee law is about. There were elements of self-determination, and you can understand why German Jews and French Jews, when all the nations around them were engaging in self-determination, and the French said, "You're not French," and the Germans said, "You're not German." So for them, Jewish self-determination was what made sense. The concerns about Zionism is the colonial element of it. that Jews came not as refugees seeking a safe haven to blend in, and not as people seeking to exercise collective rights in a way that wasn't abusive of other people's collective rights, but rather the trend that has become dominant is an abusive version of all of that. So in that sense, I would say you need to look at people's actions and what the Israeli regime and the Israeli authorities are engaging in. And that's what needs to stop. Nothing wrong with collective rights. Of course, nothing wrong with people fleeing as refugees, but you can't do that at the expense of others.
Thank you.
Thanks, Regina. Okay, I'm going to give the final question or comment to Carol Ann. Would you like to unmute yourself, Carol Ann?
Hi, actually, my comment was going to be, and pretty much has been addressed, but ever since the late 1980s, when the first Intifada started, and the word Intifada was absolutely brilliant because it described exactly what was going on, even though it required a bit of description of dogs shaking off fleas. I've been asking for so long for a new word to describe our situation, because apartheid sees it and then slips off to the side, and verbally it's into the periphery. It doesn't quite capture our situation. Yeah, there's a racial component, but if Sari came from a slightly different background, I can't distinguish when I look at her between a Muslim and a Jewish person. If I'm in South Africa, I can see. In the Middle East, we need a new word, and it would be delightful if it came out of the Arabic language. Apartheid is just too simplistic. And so we need so much more education, but I don't know how you describe it in a nutshell. That was my comment. Please, a new word that helps.
So what I can say is that many Palestinian activists, in addition to the apartheid framework, are using a framework of decolonization. And I think that those frameworks interact in a way that can express more nuance. So in apartheid, you have constructed identities. My father is an Arab Jew, but the Israeli authorities consider him to be Jewish and give him all the privileges associated with being Jewish. Because in the Israeli context, apartheid is based on Israeli Jews and Palestinians, and then there are levels of Palestinians, European Jews coming to Palestine and then taking over the land at the expense of indigenous Palestinians. But it's also responsive to concerns about Arab Jews whose identities were also colonized, who were told, don't speak Arabic, you are Western, you are not Arab. And there was all kinds of problematic within Israel colonial dynamics that took place. And also given a settler identity from indigenous to settler. And so all of those frameworks together can give us maybe a more accurate and richer picture of the nuance, and also help us think about ways to resist. And certainly a framework of decolonization allows us to bring in communities of people beyond this artificially dichotomous Arab and Jews that we hear a lot about, and lets us talk about what would it mean for all of us, Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews, Palestinians, everybody, to engage in a process of decolonization.
So I could suggest the word the Israeli army and military and government use, which is the Hebrew word hafradah, which means separation. That's actually the policy, building separate roads, and this is the word they use themselves. So perhaps that's suitable for some contexts. Anyway, we've come to the end of our allotted time, and I don't want to disrespect anyone's time, certainly not Sari's, who's been very generous coming to speak with us all today. So we're going to finish things there. But of course, this isn't the end of the conversation and the end of the efforts. We all must continue to struggle. I apologize if we didn't get to everybody's questions in the chat. I tried to kind of pick topics which were novel, but I will send the whole chat to Sari. So can't promise you'll be able to get to everybody. Of course, she's busy, but there may be chances for people to continue the conversation with her. And of course, you can obviously continue reading the books and the blogs which Sari is posting, and you can continue connecting with Green Olive via our online events and of course our physical tours. So if anybody is able to visit now that the borders are reopened and the pandemic seems to hopefully be on its way out the door, we'd love to welcome you all back on the ground. And of course this event was recorded, so this will be on our YouTube channel in the next day or so. So if anybody wants to share this with friends, please tell them to subscribe on our YouTube channel, and you'll be able to watch it there and catch up with anything you missed or share it with other people. So before I give Sari the last word, I'll say from my point of view, from behalf of the Green Olive Collective, thank you all very, very much for joining us. Thank you, Sari, very much for giving us your time. If you did enjoy the webinar and you felt it was worthwhile and you'd like to support the various charities which we mentioned at the beginning, we really appreciate your contributions. You can do that anytime on our website, contribute.greenolivetours.com. For those in the webinar, I'll paste that link in the chat once again. And we thank you for your support. You're supporting the Green Olive Collective, you're supporting the PCRF, and Sari's chosen charity, the Haifa Association for Diabetic Children in Gaza. So for me, thank you very much, and I'll leave Sari to have the final word.
Thank you very much. It's been a really nice conversation, and thank you for your challenging questions, and especially thank you to Alex for hosting me, and to the Green Olive Collective for hosting me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Happy holidays and stay
Thank
safe.
you very much.
Say hi to your kids, Sari.
Thank you.
We've been hearing them. Happy holidays to all of you. Bye-bye, Alex. Take care.
You.
Bye-bye. Thank you.